Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's Spotlight Talk. My name is Katie. I am the Deputy Director of Operations and Public Engagement. And today's talk will actually be given by Ethan Snyder, who is our Collections and Public Programs Manager. Looking forward to today's talk. It looks like it'll be a cozy group of us here, but feel free to ask questions as we go along. You can put those in the chat. Otherwise, you can save them for the end, and you can either type them in then or just ask them aloud once we've gotten through the end of the little discussion. It should be a great time. I'll also ask that you just keep yourself on mute as we go through the talk, just so we don't get confused about where sounds are coming from. Before I send it over to Ethan, I just want to mention that our birthday bash is coming up Saturday, July 13th. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're organizing for lots of artists and demonstrators and partner organizations to have hands-on activities and tables set up in the workshop. The studio will be open. There's going to be live music. There's going to be food, all kinds of good stuff. So put that on your calendar. Don't miss it. Tickets are up and for sale on the website now. Ethan also has been organizing a wonderful book club. So he could tell you about that at the end of the program, but definitely worth getting that on your radar as well. That's a great way to kind of take a deep dive into Esherick's ideas and things happening in his library. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Ethan, and you can get started with the program. Thank you.
Katie. So I'm going to get my screen shared here. So give me just a moment. Just move this out of the way. And everyone can see this okay? Thumbs up, Katie. All right, perfect. So hello, everyone. Again, my name is Ethan Snyder, and I'm the Manager of Collections and Public Programs here at the Wharton Esherick Museum. And for today's Spotlight Talk, we are going to be exploring Wharton Esherick's record keeping with a special focus on his ledger book. And this ledger book documents some of Esherick's earliest work, spanning from 1920 to almost the end of the decade. So as you might already know, if you've seen our recent collections exhibition that just closed, or our 30th annual juried woodworking show that just opened, our annual theme at the museum this year is rhythms. So something as seemingly mundane as this ledger book here, I think becomes super intriguing when we think about it in this context. Artifacts like this ledger book that are used for record keeping help us understand the many rhythms of Esherick's life and work. For example, because this ledger book traces Esherick's work in the early days of his career, it helps us understand the changing rhythms of his work as he moved from painting to carving frames to printmaking to full-fledged furniture and sculpture. Documentation such as Esherick's card catalogs, another form of record keeping that we'll look at a little later, gives us a glimpse into the rhythm of an individual work of art and their travel for various exhibitions. So before we dive headfirst into some of these records, I think this is a nice opportunity to also share how we use these artifacts in our own work at the Esherick Museum today. So these records are infinitely helpful in many aspects of our work, and as we seek to understand Esherick's work better. So for instance, Esherick didn't always sign or date his prints. So if we come across a print and we'd like to know when it was made, this ledger book can often help us determine when a particular woodblock was first carved and first struck, and it can give us an idea of the earliest possible date that any given print could have been made. Another way that these types of records help us is determining an object's particular exhibition history, the species of wood any given sculpture or piece of furniture is made from, and which of Esherick's prints were particularly popular and were sold or exhibited most frequently. There are many other ways these types of records come in handy for us, and these are just a few examples. One final example of how this ledger book might come in handy, which I think is a little more heady, but still really interesting, is understanding the particular context of a piece and thinking about what other things that Esherick might have been working on at the time and how the other things he might have been working on informed a particular piece in question. So let's take a look at this ledger book. This is the first page that we're looking at here. And from the sticker on the inside, which reads WM Penton and Bro, it was most likely acquired in Philadelphia. And Penton's was a stationer and printer and blank bookmaker located in Old City, Philadelphia. They had two addresses that were right around the corner from one another. So one was probably a place where they printed and bound books, and the other one was their retail location. And we see a couple of interesting little help wanted ads for Penton Bros for young men for feeding a printer or an errand boy and things like that. And it's likely over at 414 Walnut Street where Letty or Wharton would have purchased this ledger book originally. So it appears that Wharton and Letty planned to use this book as a couple, but didn't originally buy it for the purpose of documenting Wharton's artwork. We don't know exactly what year the couple or Wharton or Letty individually purchased this book, but it appears that they acquired it for the intention of recording their finances and investments. And you can see here this early page reads Esherick, Letty Nofer, Philadelphia Savings Fund, and Esherick Wharton Savings Fund and Rep Trust. So the several following pages are blank, but once we reach the next page with text, this suddenly becomes a catalog because the page reads catalog 1920, 1921. And we see a fundamental change in what this book was going to be used for. And I think it's telling. I don't really have too many thoughts on it at the moment yet, but I do think it's telling that Wharton and Letty scrapped a book that they originally bought to track their finances and instead started using it to track Wharton's artwork around the year that they went to Fairhope, Alabama, and Wharton started to experiment with wood. So who was it who began keeping track of Wharton's work? We can't be 100% certain. However, when we take a look at the handwriting, it appears remarkably similar to the handwriting in Letty's Garden Ledger from around 1925. And Bob Bascom, who wrote Esherick's biography entitled Journey of a Creative Mind, suggests that it was Letty who authored Wharton's ledger book. And around the time that Letty suffered from encephalitis in 1929, the handwriting in the ledger book changed and appears to be much more like Wharton's, and the recording of his work becomes much less diligent and methodical. And we'll take a look at some of that a little later. And I'm left thinking, and I truly don't have an answer quite yet, as to what it means that Letty began recording Wharton's work when she did in 1920. Is it because Wharton occasionally sold paintings here and there that they started to record this stuff? Or was the couple feeling particularly optimistic as they began recording work that Wharton would eventually find some success? Or was it because this was a year when Esherick began exhibiting paintings more frequently and in places further afield, such as New York City and Newport, Rhode Island? So that first year in the ledger book, 1920 to 1921, is filled with documentation on watercolors and travel. There are watercolors, oil paintings, and things like that from Fairhope, Alabama, Cape Cod, the Adirondacks, and Boston. There's a smattering of pastels as well that are done close to home in Chester County and many further away, again, in places like Fairhope, upstate New York, and Cape Cod. The ledger book not only documents the painting titles and mediums, but also the size of the canvas and often the frame size and frame style. That the frame style is documented tells us that by this time in 1920 to 1921, Wharton was already carving his own frames, and the styles the book refers to are various surface treatments that Esherick was experimenting with up to that point to finish these hand-carved frames. And here you can see a great photo of some of Wharton's bronze materials that he used and an example of one of these carved frames below. And these recipes for Esherick's bronze treatments are undoubtedly really important resources, not only for understanding how he achieved these kinds of finishes on his frames, but for any future conservation treatments that these frames might require as well. And you can't really beat having the original recipe on hand. So according to this ledger book, the rhythm of Wharton's work began to change between 1921 and 1922. Not only are woodcuts made for Mary Marcy's Rhymes of Early Jungle Folk, but Esherick begins to find more success in printmaking than painting. The only downside of this success in printmaking is that it appears that these prints sell for a significantly lower price than the paintings. And where paintings might occasionally sell for $50 or $75, the many prints that Esherick was selling were for the most part between $5 and $15. However, we can see here that by 1923, which is the page that the ledger book is open to in this image, the documentation of Esherick's print sales and prints sent out to galleries for sale can no longer be kept to a single page in the ledger book. By this year, sales are spilling over into 3 full pages and consignments to galleries close to 9 pages in total. And even in these earliest years of Esherick's printmaking practice, the sales foretell some of the prints that would become most popular with his patrons for the remainder of the decade, such as April Plowing, February, and Breaking in the Young Colts. And here we can see Breaking in the Young Colts and April Plowing as well. So again, the rhythms begin to change in 1924, and a new section is added to the ledger book called Other Work. The other work you can see here on the right-hand side of the page records some of Esherick's earliest three-dimensional work in wood. Some of these objects might be familiar to you, such as Esherick's latticework carving of the firebird called My Tsar Petitsa, made from poplar, or the stone slab bird in the rain that's now inset into the studio's bathroom on the first floor. Other objects on this list appear to be a little bit of a mystery, such as a 4-inch ebony figure that was lost by the Whitney Museum. I'm not sure if this was ever found again, and if it had a more specific title, it might be easier to track down. Nonetheless, though, during this year, Esherick was still actively making prints, selling them, and exhibiting his woodblock prints and engravings around the country. So it's not until 1926 into 1927, which is the year the studio was completed, that Esherick's production of three-dimensional works in wood began to overtake his printmaking practice. And you can see here on this page that the other work section is much longer than the prints made. So we can see that Esherick's practice is beginning to change. And this is also the year that Esherick begins to exhibit his sculpture in earnest. The following year, 1927 into 1928, Esherick begins to exhibit his furniture alongside his sculpture at the American Designers Gallery, and begins also to send out photographs of his work for exhibition as well. This would be the final year that Letty seems to have kept records for her husband, and this change in record keeping again coincided with Letty's encephalitis, which likely left her too ill to be able to focus on documenting her husband's work. There are only a few more pages in this book that proceed, and they show Esherick's own scrawl with a much less fastidious system for documenting the work that he was making, selling, exhibiting, and gifting to friends. And here on this slide, we see a couple objects that are recorded in these pages, such as the title page for Song of Solomon, which came out that year, as well as this beautiful sculpture that you might be familiar with from the studio called Firstborn, made in 1927. However, various pieces of correspondence tucked into this ledger book give us an idea of the extent to which Letty was managing Wharton Esherick's business and practice. For example, in 1924, Carl Zigrisser, the owner of the Via Gallery in New York City and a friend of the family from the Doing Gardner dance camp, wrote to Letty specifically to let her know that a new batch of Wharton's prints had arrived safely to his gallery and that a check for $33.60 was enclosed for the sale of 10 prints that had previously sold. The small piece of correspondence suggests that Wharton's focus was primarily on making artwork, and it fell to Letty not only to document her husband's work, but to correspond with gallery owners, museum curators, patrons, as well as organizing work to be sent out for exhibition, organizing the return of work, negotiating consignments with galleries, managing the money brought in from sales, and so on and so forth. It appears that Wharton wasn't left to his own devices for too long after Letty experienced her bout with encephalitis. A second ledger book was begun the following year in 1929 and documents Wharton's work from 1929 all the way until 1938. A note slipped into the cover page of the second ledger book notes that according to Ruth Esherick, Wharton's daughter, that the handwriting inside is Priscilla Bunton's. And if you don't know who Priscilla Bunton is, as Bob Bascom discusses in his biography of Wharton, Priscilla Bunton was a weaver that the family met at the Doing Gardner dance camp in the Adirondacks, where they also met that gallery owner, Carl Zigrisser. Priscilla was invited to live with the Esherick family at their farmhouse down the hill from the studio in 1929. And at Sunnycrest, Priscilla helped with the garden and the kitchen. She helped with the children. She kept records for Wharton. And as a form of physical therapy for Letty after her experience with encephalitis, helped her with a new 4-heddle loom that she acquired that sat in the family farmhouse. And that using this loom for Priscilla and Letty was a form of physical therapy in one form or another. And Priscilla became more and more involved in Esherick's practice as the years progressed. According to Bob, Priscilla became deeply involved in Esherick's largest and arguably most complicated commission, the Curtis Bach House project that started in the mid-1930s. And according to Bob, Bunton was enlisted to help keep books, prepare payroll, pay bills, and send invoices to Bach for this project. And what we're looking at here is a page from the second ledger book in 1934, as well as the opening page to the Bach account. And while we know that handwriting is not necessarily a science, I think we see some big similarities between these two pieces of paper and the handwriting on them, particularly with these T's and how they're done. And presumably this is Priscilla's handwriting and that she would have been keeping these separate accounts as well as many others. And here's a photo that we found of Priscilla Bunton from a newspaper in 1918 that was sourced from the Boston Herald. So the Bach project included dozens and dozens of people and was undoubtedly a really, really challenging task to manage. These are records where we see people's names that we've never heard before and we never hear since. And it undoubtedly, required a lot of contractors, people just to do one-off things like plumbing and electricity and things like that. But on this page of the Bach records, we can see that Priscilla Bunton inscribes her own bookkeeping into this account for the Bach project and marks the time that she spent keeping records for this complex project in order. And this is only one sample of the many times that we see Priscilla's bookkeeping showing up in her own records, which I think is quite wonderful. In addition to her administrative duties, Bunton wove some of the upholstery fabrics for the Bach project as well, and later on in 1939-1940 was brought on to Esherick and George Howe's model room at the New York World's Fair called Pennsylvania Hill House to include some of her own work. We know that Wharton Esherick was a great collaborator and recognized talents in people that he didn't have himself. So the fact that Esherick hired Priscilla originally to keep records, but then later hired her to make fabrics for the Bach House and the World's Fair suggests that he recognized her talent enough that he didn't want her to merely be relegated to bookkeeping alone. And in this photograph of the Pennsylvania Hill House, we can see Priscilla Bunton's textile covering the bed here in the back. And in the price list for the exhibition, the fabric is listed for $105 for 7 yards, which rivals some of the prices for Wharton's own work. So it's, without a doubt that Wharton really respected her weaving talents, and it was priced with respect to those talents and skills. So while Priscilla's ledger is slightly less detailed than the one that Letty kept, it documents Wharton's completed work, the exhibitions his work was included in, but it doesn't appear to include Wharton's sales. And I think that this is likely because by this point, the ledger was only one of many forms of record keeping that Bunton was doing for Esherick. She created these separate accounts and records for particular clients and commissions that go into much, much further detail than the book that Letty was previously keeping. And for Letty, I don't really think that there was a need to keep separate accounts for particular projects and patrons, since Wharton's business wasn't as successful or complicated during the 1920s. The separate accounts that Bunton kept for the Bach House Commission that you see here give us an idea of some of those other forms of record keeping that his business required. There are separate records as well for clients like Marjorie Content, Helene Fisher, the Hedgerow Theater, and many others that went into and required really fastidious details that the Bach project required as well. And we don't know for sure when Priscilla Bunton stopped working for the Esherick family. However, according to an interview that was conducted with Wharton, that's now part of our museum's oral history collection, Priscilla's work for Wharton likely ended around the time that she married someone named Emile Gauguin in 1943, who is none other than the son of the famous painter Paul Gauguin. We don't know that Wharton met Emile or Paul, but he remembers in this oral history that Emile took great interest in Priscilla. And we don't know too much about the relationship beyond that, but we do know from his obituary that Emile worked as a construction engineer. And this was pulled from his obituary from the New York Times in January 1955. And Emile Gauguin, the husband of Priscilla and son of Paul Gauguin, is not to be confused with an artist by the name of Emile Gauguin, who actually kind of came about a generation after Paul Gauguin. So there are a couple Gauguins floating around who are artists out there. But elsewhere in that interview with Wharton, he recalls Priscilla Bunton as being, quote, a wonderful secretary, and that she did all of the bookkeeping for him. And when Miriam Phillips, Esherick's later in life partner and love, began to handle some of his business and correspondence, she claims that much of her success depended on the fastidious work that Priscilla Bunton did before her. Oops, sorry about that. So while there are so many more ways that Esherick and the folks around him kept records, we don't have time to dig into all of them today, but we do have time to share one final source of documentation that's a little different than the ledger books kept by Letty Esherick and Priscilla Bunton. If you've been to the studio before, you might have noticed this small cabinet in the main gallery that's tucked underneath the sideboard, and that is adorned with this beautiful indigenous basket given to Wharton by his friend Marjorie Content. And inside of one of the drawers is a rather extensive card catalog that was first created and maintained by Priscilla Bunton. Where the ledger book traces Esherick's work in a kind of chronological fashion, the card catalog is largely organized by the title of a work and sometimes by the type of work. So for example, there's a whole section just for tables. And each piece this catalog records is given its own index card that documents the name of the work, when it was made, what materials it was made of, what exhibitions it was featured in, where they took place, when they take place, and if a piece was sold, the price it was listed for, and who it sold to. So let's take a look at an example. And this is a card catalog entry for the bronze casting of the sculpture Cat and Snake that you see here, and which lives on the shelf in Esherick's gallery or main gallery in the studio in front of the south-facing windows that overlook the valley. The original wooden sculpture is done in snakewood and was made in 1925, and this catalog entry specifies that two castings were made. We can't be sure exactly what year these castings were done, but we can narrow it down by looking at the kind of scrawls on this. So we see the date 1925 and 1935, and we can also kind of narrow it down by the earliest exhibition, which was at the Wayne Garden Club in 1932. And while this cast sculpture was variably listed for $75, as you can see here on the top, and then repriced at $175 a little later on, one copy was sold to someone by the name of John Lewis that we can see documented here in the corner for a total of $95. And a few things in this card catalog in particular stand out to me. One, it notes John Lewis's son, Howard, who became the owner after his father passed away. And this note is dated to 1979, well after Esherick's death and well into the studio's first decade as a museum. And that tells me that there's a possibility that curators and early museum staff at the Wharton Esherick Museum attempted to track down where sculptures may have ended up after they left the possession of their first owner if they weren't donated to the museum. The second thing in this card catalog entry that stands out to me is that while it may have been started by Priscilla Bunton, the mantle was clearly passed on to someone else after Priscilla married and departed the hillside. Miriam Phillips likely contributed to these catalogs and continued building them out through the years. And as Miriam and Wharton themselves said in their interview that I mentioned earlier, much of the work Miriam did to upkeep Esherick's business records was built on Priscilla Bunton's previous work. So the handwriting on here, below the typed text, I would attribute to Miriam, but we'd have to look at some of her handwriting a little more closely to make a more educated guess with that. And this card catalog also helps us to determine the history of the casting that we have on display at the museum too. The note on the bottom of this card catalog entry specifies that Esherick borrowed back the second casting that was made, which sold in 1968 at a PAFA exhibition for a total of $600. So that's much more than the first one sold for. And I guess by 1968, Esherick felt that he could price things a lot differently. But the following year in 1969, after this second casting was sold, Esherick borrows it back so that he can make a casting for himself. And that casting has lived at the museum ever since. We talked about this a little bit in a previous spotlight about Esherick's bronze castings. So if you want to learn more, I would recommend checking that out. And even though the records that we're covering today are only a small sampling of what we hold at the Esherick Museum, they give us both a macro and a micro sense of the rhythms of Esherick's life and work. These records can give us a glimpse into the rhythms of a life's work or a single object, the changing nature of an artistic practice, unforeseen changes in one's family life, relationships with friends, colleagues, and clients as well. And one thing that I found most interesting as, I did the research and put this spotlight together is that ultimately these ledger books and other forms of record keeping are so much less about Esherick's own record keeping than they are about the various women who helped him with the critical business of upkeeping his business during his long career. So that's about it for the spotlight talk. And before we open it up for questions, I just want to reiterate those upcoming events that Katie mentioned at the beginning. On July 10th, we have our penultimate book club. We'll be reading some short stories by Catherine Mansfield, who I think is a really, really brilliant short story writer and who helped pioneer that genre in the 20th century. She was very good friends with D.H. Lawrence, for whom Esherick made his well-known Porcupine print for. And then a little later in the month, actually just later in that week, we have Esherick's birthday bash, where we'll be celebrating with partner organizations like the Docks Thrash House, Barnstone Art for Kids, Nakashima Woodworkers, and have some hands-on activities exploring printmaking, textiles, woodworking, and we'll also be featuring some talks from the artists in our 30th annual juried woodworking show. So now we can open up for questions. I'll stop sharing my screen, but if you want me to turn back to anything in particular, I'd be more than happy to.
I
Thank
have
you.
a question.
Oh, go right ahead. Go right ahead.
Okay, it's Cheryl. I got
Cheryl.
a couple. Hi, I got a couple questions. First of all, is the record keeping chest? Did he make that? I get asked that all the time.
That's a good question. And I can try to look that up quickly as you throw me your second question.
Okay. The second thing is the pillows that are woven in the bed on the sofa in upstairs in his bedroom. Are they Letty's or are they Priscilla Buttons?
Yeah, so as far as I know, we don't have any work by Priscilla Bunton in the studio beyond the records that she was keeping for Wharton. One of the pillows, and Katie, correct me if I'm mistaken here, one of the pillows is woven by Letty that's in the bedroom.
Yeah,
And
that's the blue and white, like overshot pattern. Yeah.
yeah, and
Right.
then the printed pillow is a pattern by June Groff, who is a fabric artist that Wharton was friends with. She also had some work at the World's Fair that was included alongside Priscilla Bunton's as well.
Okay, and my last question for
Yeah.
you is, so with Priscilla Bunton, and they separate, Wharton and Esherick officially separated in 37, correct?
Um,
1937.
I believe so, like that date or
Did
somewhere.
Priscilla Bunton have something to play in that?
Not that I know of. Arguably if it was anyone who, had a part in that, it was probably his friendship um with Hannah Weil, the
Oh,
idol
okay.
carver. But we have an idea that Wharton was informally living at the studio well before 1937. And
Okay.
the way that I understand it is that after the World's Fair, or I guess with the prospect of the World's Fair coming up, Wharton knew that he would get enough money to be able to kind of build a bedroom in there so that he could formally move in and then kind of separate from Letty.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Oop.
How much did you say his paintings sold for early on in your talk?
Yeah, so they sold for, they occasionally sold, I will say, for about $50, $75. And it seems like the earliest sales, and no shade to Wharton, of course, but were to like his family and then very close friends. So I think one of the first sales was to Dottie Esherick. One of them was to someone at the dance camp. So it seems like he wasn't necessarily being discovered by people who didn't know him before, until he started getting those prints out there.
Yeah, right. I really enjoyed this talk. And can you send the recording
Yeah,
afterwards?
definitely. And if you want to, we can share it with you. I don't know if we can do it over email or if we can just kind of share it some other way, but a kind of PDF with some of the images from the catalog. Because I think it's interesting for you as someone who gives tours, but it's just a kind of different way to understand Esherick's work, all in all.
I thought it was fascinating with the information you get out of the card catalog and all the records.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so much to explore and learn.
Yeah, and I think we'd know a lot less about Wharton's work and practice if we didn't have these records.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love, just to echo what Gay is saying, I love that there's really like a story to be told through
Yeah.
looking at this very, the way you're talking about like the shifts that are happening at different moments in his career, that is not the purpose of that book whatsoever. And yet in retrospect, we see, these major changes in his life echoed just through the bookkeeping.
Yeah.
I was curious just to ask, and this is not the focus, so maybe you don't know, but did Priscilla Bunton, do you know if she like made weavings that were sold or shared through other galleries? Like was she someone who was selling her craft work or giving lessons in that, or is it just kind of something that we know of through the World's Fair show?
Yeah, it seems like it's primarily something that we know through the World's Fair show. There's, digging through old newspapers, there's very little out there about her. And mainly it's, connected with her husband's obituary or her early life in Boston. But I kind of have an inkling that the fact that she was involved with the dance camp in the Adirondacks meant that she might have been teaching weaving
Yeah.
before. So we could call her a kind of practicing artist or a teaching artist,
Yeah.
but I couldn't really find much about her selling weavings outside of the World's Fair list.
I mean, speaking of record keeping, that is a field that's probably not well documented in terms of like, you know, um, such a beautiful craft, not necessarily something that was getting records in the same way, or
Yeah,
that sort of
yeah.
thing.
And I
Like,
mean, I also imagine that the way that Bob and Wharton describe her was that she kind of didn't have like a penny to her name when they met her at the dance camp. So it really seems like the work that Wharton gave her was her primary mode of income. And I wonder if in some sense she might not have had the time to do her own work, or that, she was so focused on documenting Esherick's work that she wouldn't have documented her own.
mm. Well, thank you so much, Ethan.
Yeah.
Really fascinating. Maybe we can do a little digging into whether Esherick made the card catalog, and we'll let everybody know on that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Ah,
'Cause I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure either, and I couldn't easily find
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Gay, do you happen to know?
no, I don't know. Oh,
Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, the dovetails aren't like wedged, but they're straight. So just from, my memory of looking at it just yesterday too, I have a feeling that that might have been something that was like industrially manufactured and then Wharton bought. But we'll take another look and get back to everyone because I don't want to misspeak too soon.
the drawers, the two drawers in the middle of the bed, they're straight, I think.
Oh, okay.
I think, I could be wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
now
if
that
he
you
did
mention
those
that, they
drawers,
seem similar. Yeah.
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 All
Well,
right.
hopefully we can find out and give an answer for everyone. So you're not left wondering for too long.
Okay.
Before we let everyone go, I was able to
Oh.
find the file cabinet in our collections database, and it attributes it to Wharton Esherick, made in 1938. Um, and it's made of pine and walnut and pine ply. But that's about all of the information that we have on it so far. So there's definitely more to be learned. But we can say for now that Wharton made it and
Made
like
it, right.
1938. Yeah.
Yeah, so very good. All right, so, well, this was great.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Take